Welcome back to the podcast, Unbinding the Bible. This is episode 147, Confronting Power Over Christianity. And in this episode, I want to talk about just that. I want to talk about power over Christianity and what I think that means to some extent, and then why I believe a confrontation of that is necessary, and why I think it's sometimes hard to hear. So I'm going to use a little bit of my own story and share a few things with you, some thoughts that I have written down about my own life and what ultimately has led me to the place where I feel like this is a necessity, but is also something I get is hard to swallow sometimes. And so I want to talk through some things, because what we're going to do in grinding down our golden calf is we're going to have to confront the ways in which some of the normally assumed things about God, about ourselves, about the world, and about what Jesus has come to do might in fact need to be confronted. And it's hard to hear that sometimes, but definitely necessary. So that's really what I want to do in this episode, and I hope that it will set us up so that we can go the next several weeks and you'll understand maybe how to prepare yourself to hear what we're going to talk about. So let's just get right into it. As I shared in the introduction, what I want to do in this episode is just what the title implies, and that is that I want to confront a power over type of Christianity. And as I thought about this, the title of this episode really does capture what it is that I feel I have been doing for quite a few years on the podcast. And so what I want to do in this episode is continue a little bit more of the same, but I want to back up just a bit. I may have touched on this at various points. I can't quite remember. But I want to read for you something that kind of reads like a journal entry of mine, although it is just something that I typed out in my podcast Word document earlier this morning in preparation for this week's episode. And so I just want to read a few things which kind of gives the rationale and the explanation for me for why it is that I want to confront power over Christianity. And I think I do an okay job of trying to tie together how this works, why this isn't always well received, and where I think some of the blind spots are in at least the public expression of the Christian faith, and then how that does in fact trickle down into individual expressions of the Christian faith. And so I will by no means exhaust this topic. Even as I'm talking now, I'm thinking of several more things I should have written to make this more complete. But this podcast is a work in progress. Nothing is polished and perfect, and I'm okay with that, and I hope you are too. So without any more of me rambling, let me just read a couple pages of some things that I wrote, which I think will set us up to sort of talk through this in a way that I think will be helpful. A large part of my story involves taking a deep dive into all the parts of my internal world, as well as my external relationships that did not line up with a faithful expression of the Christian faith. Of course, this quickly turned into another deep dive into just what the Christian faith is actually all about, and whether or not what I had been taught growing up accurately captured the spirit of what Jesus came to set up. I've chosen the word confronting because for the better part of the past 6 years, this is exactly what I have been experiencing: a confrontation. A confrontation regarding many things I had thought were normal, right, and good, but were actually just the opposite. I've had to confront belief systems, lies that I had believed, as well as lies that I had told, ways of thinking that were destructive to others around me as well as to myself. I've had to confront the fact that emotionally speaking, I was undeveloped and immature and did not understand or apply basic principles to my everyday life. Things like boundaries, regulating my own emotions, not basing my decisions on fear, rightly expressing anger and frustration in healthy ways, choosing to allow my emotions to run their course instead of suppressing them, opening up about things that mattered to the people that could help me, trusting others with my real-life struggles, and choosing to believe that what I wanted was just as important as what others wanted. For me, though, the difficulty began the moment I started to see just how much my way of thinking, acting, reacting, and processing my interactions with other people affected the way I interacted with God. I thought, acted, reacted, and processed my interactions with God in all the same ways that I had done with others. And guess what? If my thinking, acting, reacting, and processing my interactions with other people had a faulty foundation, then perhaps my relationship with God did as well. This is what caused me to take a giant step back. Until 6 years ago, I didn't know that my thinking, acting, reacting, and processing my interactions with other people was dysfunctional. I thought all the ways I thought, acted, reacted were perfectly normal. And I viewed my relationship with God as normal too. But what if that relationship was also dysfunctional? If I could go through life thinking I was a decent person, only to realize that I was harming the very people I thought I loved, then wasn't it possible that my view of the Christian faith could be doing the same thing? These were my questions, based on my own life experiences. For years, I tried to stifle them, but I won't do that any longer. My experiences are real, and I'm determined to confront every facet of the Christian faith with as much vigor as I'm currently confronting every facet of my emotional and psychological self. Now, let me be clear. It hurts to do this. It's frustrating, it's exhausting, it's angering, humiliating, confusing, and frightening. But I refuse to be spoon-fed lies any longer. I refuse to be enslaved to my own dysfunctions, unable to enjoy life, other people, or myself. And I'm finding that the more I confront the dysfunctions and adopt healthy emotional ways of living instead, the more real life opens up to me. Things start to make more sense. I find that I experience more joy. Others appreciate what I have to offer the world, and I don't carry shame or the false expectations that I'm responsible for other people's decisions, emotions, or actions. And this has been happening to me nonstop for the past 6 years. But as I've already said, if my own thoughts, actions, reactions, and processing my interactions with others could have been so out of whack, could not my thoughts, actions, reactions, and processing my interactions with God fall prey to the same dysfunction? The answer I've come to is yes. And so I'm leaving no stone unturned, no concept unquestioned. I'm confronting all of it. From my evangelical upbringing, I was a model Christian. I faithfully attended church several times a week, prayed regularly, read my Bible, memorized large chunks of my Bible, knew I needed God in my everyday life, and even chose to serve him as a pastor for the past 20 years. And I still lived with dysfunctions. That is not a coincidence. And so part of my confrontation has been to explore the connection between these two dysfunctions. My evangelical upbringing and its conception of God and the Christian faith, and my emotional dysfunctions that were ruining my relationships. Did one create the other? Did they feed off one another? And if so, how? Where do our beliefs about God come from? And how do those beliefs affect or not affect the way we live? What do my reactions toward other people say about what I really believe? And why is so little attention given to emotional health and self-awareness in the Christian teaching I received? Now, here's where things get interesting. I realize that not everyone has had my experience. At times, I wish everyone did. At other times, I wouldn't wish what I'm going through on anyone. But I realize that whether I ask for self-awareness or not, I'm right in the middle of it, and there's no going back. I've learned to embrace it, and most of the time, I'm thankful for it. And because I've literally pulled the rug out from everything I used to count on as absolutely certain, I'm growing more comfortable with confronting other things that I believe need challenged. And that leads to the difficulty. For the fact of the matter is that not everyone is as eager as me to confront parts of the Christian faith that do not make sense or that don't fit. Not everyone is as eager as me to dismantle inconsistencies or to show hypocrisy when it's running rampant. Not everyone is as eager as me to see dysfunctions in their own lives and then be forced to admit that many of those same dysfunctions are potentially at work in the faith they cling to with such ferocity. And at times, I've been misunderstood. People have gotten upset, and I get it. I really do. But I'm not going to stop confronting. I can't. Too much rides on us getting things right in the world. And I'm thankful for this podcast platform to be able to work out these thoughts. And many of you have been a very instrumental part in that, in engaging me with questions, with comments, with additional stories that really bring this to life. And so my thoughts right now, as they've been for several years, center largely on the way the Christian church has expressed its faith in the public sphere. In America, the way that typically happens is through partisan politics. And as I'm sure you can imagine, growing up, I was taught how clearly the Republican Party's platform most faithfully represented the Christian faith. And of course, here's where most of the pushback comes from when I start confronting. And the reason I receive pushback is because baked into the teaching that the Republican Party best represents the Christian faith is the simultaneous teaching that the Democratic Party best represents its antithesis. And so what most often happens when I confront is that I'm either ignored, accused of holding to an unbiblical or secular worldview, or simply called a Democrat and dismissed. But life in the real world doesn't work like that. One cannot simply dismiss a confrontation. Well, I mean, you could dismiss a confrontation, but then you'd have no category with which to understand Jesus, because it honestly seems as if confrontation was all he ever did. And so the question I want to ask is it possible that Jesus wants to confront Christians with as much vigor as we wish he'd confront others? And my answer, once again, is yes. And so that's what I'm doing, because I honestly believe that's what Jesus did. And because I genuinely believe that is what Jesus is doing, present tense, with me. And so a passage that surfaces a lot in my own mind when I think about power over Christianity is Matthew chapter 20. Jesus has just been approached by James and John. One of the gospel accounts say that James and John's mother approaches on their behalf. One of the accounts says that the brothers themselves do it. I think both can be true. But nonetheless, James and John approach Jesus or have their mother do it and want to know if they can sit at Jesus' right and his left in his kingdom. And the other disciples are indignant. They get pretty disgusted with James and John, pretty upset that they would have the audacity to push themselves forward as to those who are going to be placed in the greatest seats of prominence. They're going to be the ones most recognized. They're going to be given the highest seats of honor in the coming kingdom. That's clearly what's occupying James and John's minds, which is exactly, of course, why the disciples get upset, although I don't tend to tip my hat to the other 10 as being humble. It's very possible they got indignant because James and John beat them to the punch. They were the first to get to Jesus to ask for those seats, and maybe the other disciples wished that they had thought of that plan before. We're not really told, and it doesn't really matter because Jesus' response is all that I want to focus on. And he says in verse 25 of Matthew 20, Jesus called them to him and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So the power over concept is that Jesus is expressing the rulers of the Gentiles lord their authority over people. They believe that they are the ones who are in charge. They believe that it is their job to force or to require or to arrogantly assert their authority over people, to tell other people what to do. And people who view the world this way naturally imagine this is the way God functions. And this is why I said, and why I will never stop saying it, that our own understanding of our own lives completely dictates the way we will think about God. We as image bearers of him, the way we think he rules is the way we are going to rule. And the things that feel normal and natural to us are oftentimes mirrored onto God, projected onto him as these clearly would be the ways that he would function. And so it's very possible that James and John, in asking to be seated at the right and the left, are bringing to Jesus a power over approach to ruling, which, don't forget, in Genesis 1, human beings were created and were commissioned to rule. So this is not something that's bad. The question is, how do we do it? How do we rule as followers of Jesus? How do we reign with him? Well, we do so according to Jesus, not like the Gentiles who lord it over other people or exercise authority over other people. Rather, if you want to be great, you should be a servant. If you want to be first, you need to be a slave. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so ultimately what tends to happen in conversations around politics and other such things is that we seek power, influence, and control. We use words like we want to impact the culture or we want to change the culture. And I just want us to think about those words that we are using. Those words have a little bit of violence to them. Impact the culture, like a meteor would impact the earth. Like we want to bring force upon the culture with such, we want to bring an impact on the culture with such force that we actually make a change in the culture. That is a power over mindset. That's believing that our job is best done by forcing or by shoving our weight around in the way that we approach the world. And this naturally happens when you start talking partisan politics, because what we are doing is we are tending to imagine that the best way to express the love of God to the world is by having God's ways, or the ways we believe are God's ways, imposed from our governmental structures down onto the rest of the world. The trouble that we get into as Christians is that Jesus never did that. He was invited to do that. He was invited by the men in John chapter 8 who caught the woman in adultery. He was invited to stand on the law and bring the law, thou shalt not commit adultery, to bear on a woman who was caught in adultery. Jesus, if you remember, doesn't do that. He is literally there with a crowd, with a woman, and many men whose adherence to the law, no doubt out of their love for and respect for God, brought a woman caught in the act of adultery and wanted to see what Jesus would do with respect to the law and how it impacted this woman. They wanted the law to come down swiftly. They wanted it to impact this woman. They wanted her to change her behavior, and they believed that rebuking her in the presence of Jesus with the law in their back pocket was the way to do that. Jesus, however, doesn't take that approach because he sees something else that's going on. He sees a group of people who is not in favor of this woman's life and flourishing. They are wanting to be known as people who enforce God's laws and think that if everybody does that, then God will somehow be pleased. The trouble is they're leaving and potentially, like me, were blinded to the other things that were at work in their own hearts. They liked being in these positions. I mean, think of James and John again. James and John liked the thought of being in a position seated higher than everyone else. That is a problem that creates real issues in the real world. And having Jesus just weigh in on the matter and giving them what they want doesn't address those broken aspects and dysfunctions beneath the surface. And so Jesus doesn't honor the request of the disciples, and he doesn't honor the request of the Pharisees John tells us something kind of cryptic. Jesus gets down in the dirt and he starts writing with his finger. I have no idea what Jesus is doing. Very interesting that he's doing it. He's touching the dirt like he did at the very beginning of creation when he touched the dirt there and created human beings, or brought a woman from the man. And now Jesus is bending down in the dirt again in the presence of a woman, honoring her with his I don't even know what you call it, shrewd behavior, something of that extent. But what Jesus does is he speaks to the Pharisees first and says, let the one who is without sin be the first to cast a stone. Well, the Pharisees at least had the self-awareness enough to know that they were guilty of some sins, and so they drop their stones and they walk away. Jesus meets a woman. He says to her, where are your accusers? And she was like, I don't have any. And he says, neither do I accuse you. Well, wait a minute, Jesus. I mean, what's going to cause a woman to realize her sinfulness in the presence of God, who requires holiness all the time? What's going to get her to change her behavior if it isn't you telling her what she should and shouldn't do and threatening consequences on her for not abiding by that? And the answer is compassionate, serving love, which is precisely what Jesus does. And in the midst of that, he gets everyone who's obsessed with a power over faith to leave her presence so that he can meet her with compassionate, serving love. And when he does that, as a servant, as a power under form of the Christian faith, he meets this woman and transforms her. He then sends her on her way with an exhortation to no longer sin. But that is not his first step with her. Rather, he invites her into his presence, into an accepting, warm, loving embrace. And from that place of security and safety and service and love and acceptance, he encourages her and exhorts her to live in that kind of life, which would not involve continuing in sin. Two very different ways of approaching people, and that particular story is one that continually grips me. And so I don't want you to hear when I'm talking about critiquing things, as I know people have, so I'm happy to give other explanations of why I don't think this is the case, but don't mishear me. I am not declaring that the Democratic Party is the party of power under, and the Republican Party is the power of power over. That's not what I'm saying. So when I critique one party, do not hear me as supporting the other party. This is one of the best ways that I know that we have been discipled or duped, might be a better word for it. In America, Christians tend to think Americanly before they think Christianly. And I think this is an issue that needs confronted. We are not Americans first. We are Christians first. We are part of the kingdom of God first. And the kingdom of God requires a reorientation into everything. To use the phrase I used at the beginning of this episode, thinking, acting, reacting, and processing my interactions with others in my relationships with them, in my relationship with concepts, whatever. And so don't think primarily in terms of a two-party political system. That's not helpful. We are Christians, right? So when I critique one party, don't think that means what it would mean if the opposite party was critiquing the one party, right? So on the news, if you watch Fox News, what you hear nonstop on Fox News is how the Republican Party's policies have mankind's best interests in mind and why the Democrats are the devil. If you watch CNN, you will listen to the exact same news report being given where the policies that the Democrats are putting forth are what is best for human flourishing, and the Republican Party are the demons. Like, that's the way the world works, okay? As Christians, we don't operate that way. When Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world, what he means is there is a way of thinking, acting, reacting, and processing our interactions with others that aren't limited to the options that are given to us in this world system. So hear me. And I think hear me is a good way of reminding us what Jesus said. He who has an ear, let him hear. He says this over and over. And the place this comes from is the golden calf incident in Exodus 32. I've talked about this a couple times on the podcast, and just to brief you for it here, when the psalmists refer to idolatry throughout the Bible, or throughout the Psalms, but they're referencing back to the golden calf incident, they speak of Israel as worshiping a golden calf and becoming like a golden calf. They become stubborn. They become stiff-necked. And the psalmists and even Isaiah will write, they have ears, idols have ears, but they don't hear, eyes, but they don't see, mouths, but they don't speak. Those who worship them will become like them. Which means when you pursue worshiping idols and participating in idolatry, the ears that you have become stopped up and deaf, just like a lifeless golden calf is deaf, just like a lifeless statue of someone that is erected in Washington, D.C. is likewise deaf. It's made of stone, or it's made of wood, or it's made of marble, or you craft it out of rusty pieces from broken down cars. Like, it's kind of artistic and beautiful in that way, and that's fine. But if you believe that captures the essence of that human being, or you believe that captures the essence of the divine being, it will lead you into trouble. And so when Jesus repeatedly says, he who has ears to hear, let him hear, we have to realize that every time he says that, he's speaking about the potential of idolatry lurking beneath the surface. So that's what I want to say. If I were to confront things that were firmly believed by the Republican Party, do not hear that as an automatic critique coming from the Democratic Party. When I did my last By the Book interview, I published December 23rd, 2021. So it's been several months, and I've reached out to a few people. I've got a few books in my mind, but I have taken a break from that, as many of you know, and I do intend to have another author or two on in the near future. But it was a book I did called Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. And many of you might remember that book, but I received some negative feedback after that By the Book interview. And I was asked by this person when I planned to do another interview equally condemning the Democratic Party the way I was condemning the Republican Party. That was the accusation, that was the question. And it was just asked, when do you plan to do both sides? Because the Democratic Party has just as much raunchy stuff in it as the Republican Party does. And my response was that as soon as the Democrats start saying things like, God put Biden in the White House, and they start holding public prayer services in Washington, D.C., praying for God's blessing on the president, swearing that God put Trump in office because he wanted such and such Supreme Court justices, and all of these justifications that come pouring out of the mouths of evangelical Christians like tidal waves. I said, if I start hearing that kind of stuff, then I'll start critiquing the Democratic Party. But in my experience, it's only the Republican Party who speaks like that. Now, that seemed to work in the short term. I don't know long term if this person's critique, but they heard what I said, which I was thankful for. I feel like my response is my response. You don't have to agree with it. But that's precisely why I critique the way that I do, because I'm interested in critiquing what I see as broken. And I think that Jesus is as interested or more so in critiquing his own people's wrong views than he is in what we wish he would critique other people for their views. Like, we love doing that. Jesus, did you hear what so-and-so did? Jesus, did you see what they're doing? And Jesus always says, what are you doing? Right? I mean, what happened with the Pharisees? Jesus, this woman was caught in adultery. What are you going to do about it? And what does Jesus say? What about you? Let's deal with you. Are you without sin? Did I appoint you to be the people to enforce this law? Did I make you to be my guards and my people who go around and point out to other people? Did I appoint you to be my tattletales? Like, let's deal with what's going on in you and why it is that you're so drawn to needing to be front and center at pointing out everybody's sin. Are you okay with that? What should we do here? And so that's the approach I take. And over the last several years, in the process of reading and studying and being rebuked and repenting and journaling and being angry and then getting sad and crying and going to counseling and not knowing how to navigate myself out of the mess that I'm in, all these things, I've been reading quite a bit too. And that has fueled some of the By the Books that I've done, which I'm overly thankful for. Actually, in some sense, most of the by the books I've done, I've either read recently or they've just been a few books that I have read that have really transformed the way that I think. But yeah, the last 6 years, I mean, that's everything I've done on the podcast. So the entirety of this podcast, you have been on the receiving end, at least in part, of my processing. If you've listened to the whole thing, you've heard all of it. But one of the books I did an interview on was Lee Camp's Scandalous Witness. And Camp says so many things in this book that are good. If you have not read this book, I really encourage you to do so. But he does a great job, I think, of helping us think as Christians about our partisan politics. And could not recommend that book highly enough. Definitely think that you should go get it and read it. In fact, I've read it twice, and I am putting that on my short list of the books that I'm going to read at least once a year, because it just helps so much to decipher and to hear what Jesus actually said over against the way that many people on both the religious right and the left talk about the Christian faith. And so here's what Lee Camp says, and he does this by talking about liberalism. And he talks about liberalism and the pursuit of freedom in classic Western liberalism, not in the adjectives liberal or conservative that we tend to use to talk about our two partisan political parties. Rather, he's talking about liberty or liberalism as an actual concept in Western civilization to pursue freedom and to be asking the questions of how to order society in such a way that maximum freedoms are applied to its citizens, which again is very American, and that's good in some ways, and it gets problematic in others. But here's the way Lee Camp kind of dives into this discussion and then gives us a few new labels to offer. And I just wanted to read this to you. It's just several paragraphs found on page 43 in his book, Scandalous Witness. He says, one might summarize the similarities and differences between liberal liberals and conservative liberals this way. They both support liberal institutions such as constitutional democracy, maximizing individual liberties within certain parameters, the free exercise of religion within certain parameters, and the like. But they disagree about the parameters. They disagree about the places at which individual liberties should be limited. Now, let me stop right there. That's the end of one sentence. Let me add my own little qualifier. Camp uses this idea, liberal liberals and conservative liberals, because he wants to make sure that we realize we are both liberals in the classic sense of the word. What we now have are those who think these freedoms should be given in one way, and the other group believes they should be given in another way. And he explains this, I think, very simply and very clearly. He says both parties they support liberal institutions such as constitutional democracy, maximizing individual liberties within certain parameters, the free exercise of religion within certain parameters, and the like, but they disagree about the parameters. They disagree about the places at which individual liberties should be limited. Camp goes on. Liberal liberals, for example, insist that a maximum amount of freedom should be afforded to an individual's use of their bodies, that a great deal of freedom should be extended with regard to sexual mores, gender identity, and sexual preference. For a liberal, restrictions of abortion are, put most crassly, the federal government intruding into a woman's control over her own womb. But liberal liberals believe that the government should limit what individuals and corporations are allowed to do with their money and their guns. Conservative liberals, on the other hand, insist that a maximum amount of freedom should be afforded to individuals and corporations in the use of their money and their guns. For a conservative liberal, restrictions of gun ownership are, painted in broad strokes, the beginning of the slippery slope of the federal government becoming a totalitarian state. But conservative liberals believe the government should limit what individuals are allowed to do with their bodies and sexual mores. Generally speaking, neither the liberal liberals nor the conservative liberals are posing a fundamental challenge to the basic institutions of Western liberalism. Instead, They are arguing over the proper forms of liberalism, which again does not have any sort of rigorous or compelling or thick account of what it means to be human. A king telling a businessman how to run his business is as repulsive to the conservative liberal as a king telling a woman what she will do with her womb is to the liberal. A potentially fruitful practice for American Christians then, when discussing the politics of the nation state, is for us to change our labels. Perhaps rather than ever using the term conservative, let us substitute conservative liberal, and instead of using the term liberal, let us substitute liberal. This would force us to think in different categories. Rather than seeing one such partisan movement as being the Christian one, we are forced to realize that the Tea Partier and the Green Partier are, in fact, not trying to sort out the best way to be Christian, but how to be the best partisan of liberalism. That is absolutely perfect. And here's one of the first places that we need to confront power over Christianity. One of the first places we need to confront it is not assuming that the Republican Party is the party of the Christian faith. This has been assumed. I'm just going to say it. It's not just me. I've not just lived in a shell of a life where nobody else has ever experienced what I'm experiencing, and I'm just shouting into the wind about woe is me and my bad experiences. This has gripped the hearts of millions of people. And what Lee Camp does such a good job of is showing us both parties, liberals and conservative liberals, want a maximum amount of freedom afforded to an individual. It just varies on what those things are applied to. So a conservative liberal hates the fact that government would impose on the free market and that would get in the way of my business or that would overtax me for things that I don't believe they should do. And how dare they think about touching my guns? Oh, but absolutely the government should limit what people can do sexually, what they can do when it comes time to get married. And Christians in America, particularly in the capitalistic way that we have grown up talking about the Christian faith, we have looked at our pursuit and use of money and wealth and have just decided, very conveniently, I might add, that the Bible says nothing against that. Oh, but it surely speaks against sexual things. Well, I'm not sure if you've read the New Testament or any of the Bible actually, but the Bible has an exorbitant amount to say about those issues. And so it's only fair to say, does the Bible speak about sexual things? Can I have absolute freedom and control over my own individual body, but you can't tell me what to do with my guns? Or can the Bible tell me what to do with my guns and tell me what I can do with my sexual body and how I ought to operate in this world? What we are dealing with now is looking at how the kingdom of God intersects the way both parties express freedom. People want freedom from governmental interference. And while you might be able to justify that in your own mind, the question is bigger than just, does the government have the right to interfere in my life and take over my stuff? A bigger question would be, what is my own relationship to my stuff? That's a kind of question Jesus might ask. And so when Camp starts talking about these things, I start to realize, good grief, how particular and how meticulous and how much could Jesus really confront things that we've held on to so closely? And along the way, I've just been reading several books. I've been reading books by historians. I've been reading books that are just from a slightly different perspective than I grew up hearing about. And several of them have caught my attention. They are worth a second and a third read. They're ones I've tried to get on my podcast, but have been unable because they're so popular. But I wanted to read those to you because I feel like I know this and I don't often say what I know, and I wonder if it'll make waves, and I don't care anymore. I'm getting really tired of sitting on my own hands and not moving forward in the things that I think need to be talked about. An absolutely phenomenal book that every Christian should read is a book called Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, by Kristen Kobes Dumais. If you have not read that book, go buy it and start reading it. If you don't know if you can plow through 350 pages, get it on Audible and listen to it. It is a history of the past 75 years of white conservative evangelicalism and its interactions and oftentimes twisted webs with the Republican Party, and how concepts such as masculinity and femininity have been hijacked by militaristic ideas within American culture, and what that has done in the way, in the name of the Christian faith, to the church as a whole, and how it is running rampant in our country. Maybe you won't agree with it. Maybe you will. But what I find super fascinating is how history doesn't lie. History is interpretive, but so are our theological points. And we are only able to hear what we are willing to hear, which is why Jesus will repeatedly say, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." We don't have to be afraid of the truth. We can embrace it just as it is. And another book that was very, very powerful to me too is The Making of Biblical Womanhood: How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth, by Beth Allison Barr. This too is a book that everybody should read, but Beth Allison Barr walks through some things, very simple things that I was taught growing up. Well, women aren't supposed to have authority over men, and women aren't encouraged to lead or have authority. And Beth Allison Barr walks through history and shows how, depending upon when certain Bible translations came to the surface, certain political realities were happening in our culture, and the run-of-the-mill general response was, we need to push back, and we're going to do so in our particular Bible translations. And I know for some Christians, this is really unsettling because they like to imagine that the Bible was just kind of divinely written by God, and it's exactly the way that he wanted it, down through the centuries. But we have so many different translations now, and translators, while they are doing their best to represent what they believe God says and means, also have agendas. They also have understandings of God themselves, the world, and the way things are supposed to be that won't allow them to translate certain passages in certain ways. That's not to discourage the ability we have as English readers of the Bible, but we have to be aware of that. We have to be aware of the fact that it isn't often as cut and dry as sometimes we'd like to make it. Another book I read was called The Immoral Majority: Why Evangelicals Chose Political Power Over Christian Values, by Ben Howe. Or Taking America Back for God: Christian Nationalism in the United States, by Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. Scandalous Witness, as I've already read from, A Little Political Manifesto for Christians, by Lee Camp. Another book by Camp, Mere Discipleship: Radical Christianity in a Rebellious World. And then one that very recently came out that I read just a few months ago is The Flag and the Cross: White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy, by Philip Gorski and Samuel Perry. That book had in its entirety trying to explain how conservative Christians who say they believe in Jesus so supported the January 6th nightmare of the storming of the Capitol, and had things like a noose out in front of in front of their parade or tirade or whatever they had been doing, and how they're able to say, Trump is my president, Jesus is my savior, God, guns, Trump. Like, how do all those things fit together? How do people hold those things together? And the idea of Christian nationalism, the idea that the Christian faith is somehow entwined with the civic responsibilities of America as a country, that is in large part what is the cause of the insanity. And I personally think that is the golden calf that has the strongest stranglehold on thousands, if not millions, of Christians in America. And so a book that I just started a few weeks ago and I'm not finished with yet is called The Religion of American Greatness: What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism, by Paul Miller. Now, I just shared those several titles with you, not to be like, hey, look at what I'm all reading. I realize I do reading these things a lot, and I talk about them to my wife and to my close friends, but I don't often just come right out and say, yeah, I'm reading this. Yeah, I believe it's true. Yeah, I think that these things are accurate. Yeah, I think we need to address this. Yeah, I think the things that they are identifying as hypocritical have captured huge chunks of the church. And if we are not capable or willing to listen to the argument and admit and see where there may in fact be things in our own belief systems that need confronted, well, then we might as well pack it up. Because I'm really getting tired of us playing this game where we assume that we are above critique and that anybody who dares critique us just has their own agenda. Guess what? Everybody has an agenda, including me and including you. We all do. Some people are just looking for the church to give them hope. Some people are hoping that the very people in this culture that they don't like and they don't agree with would just leave, right? That needs to be confronted. But it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen with an angry tone. And I do need to remember that when I get frustrated, that frustration isn't about people. I don't hate people. I don't dislike people. I'm dealing with some conflicts right now where some people disagree with me, and we're having a major difficulty seeing eye to eye. But I don't hate them. But I am upset by the belief systems that they have lived in, that I have lived in, which bring us to a point when we don't agree. Our first reaction is to imagine that we'll never be able to maintain relationship because of that. That's what bothers me, is that these systems have a stranglehold on people and they don't even know it. It's like me living for most of my life, still, even today, discovering new things, patterns of behavior, ways that I react when I hear something that I imagine means that I'm supposed to act in this way and I don't want to act in this way, and so I get upset. Instead of just listening to what's being presented and say, at this point, I'm not comfortable responding to that, I'm going to respond like this. And not being embarrassed that I don't have all the answers, and not being frustrated that this person is expecting something from me. People expect things from us all the time. If I don't give them exactly what they want, that's not my fault. I'm just able to respond in a way that I best feel suited for. But that's not something I've always known. In fact, I still don't often know that. I still trip up over things that I think are pretty plain and simple. And so what I want to do is I want us to look at places in the Christian faith that we have just assumed God is on our side, but be able to confront the parts of those belief systems that actually promote a power over kind of Christianity, not a power under kind. And that's a question that I think has to be talked about. It has to be addressed. And the things that we literally, we kind of call them, right? We call them sacred cows, right? In our culture, or at least I grew up in a culture that called them that. These are sacred cows. You don't mess with certain things. You don't mess with this. You don't mess with that. You say whatever you want. Just don't cross that person. Don't suggest this as a possibility because that's going to make a bunch of waves. Don't make waves. Don't rock the boat. Don't stir. Anytime you hear a phrase like that, don't rock the boat, that's a sacred cow, don't talk about that, that is code language for there's an idol present and there will be hell to pay for you if you point it out that it's an idol and you try to knock it down. So that's just free advice for you. Actually, everything on this podcast is free, but that was a bonus point. Just know that. Tuck that away somewhere. When you panic at the thought that some truth would come to light, that's when you know idolatry is present. And in the golden calf incident, when Moses comes down from the mountain, he grinds the golden calf down into dust, sprinkles it on the water, and makes the people of Israel drink it. Because what's happening in that story is that Moses goes for the priests. He disciplines the priests who were to be for the people, the representatives of the true character and nature of the God Moses was receiving the law from while they were committing the idolatry. But the idea there is the same. The discipline that God gives is on the people who should have been his faithful representatives. In the same way that the people that are in Christ, that are the church, are to be the faithful representatives of God's character to the world. So when God comes in judgment, And 1 Peter 4 tells us that judgment begins with the household of God. What he means is that judgment first comes to those who've been met by Christ, the way Christ met the woman caught in adultery, who've been met by Jesus with compassion, with understanding, and with love. And from that point are then exhorted and commissioned and called to give up their lives of sin. So when judgment begins with the household of God, what Peter means and what Jesus means is that God is first going to bring his confronting judgment to his own people, because they're the ones who know that he comes in love, not in hate. They're the ones who've already experienced his embrace, not his rejection. And they come to him in love, not out of fear. Those then, we are the only people on the planet capable of receiving the kind of critique and kind of confrontation that God ultimately needs to give to the world. It first comes to the church. And that's why I want to talk about the church. That's why I talk about, and I said in episode 144, right before I took a break for the summer, I said there's so much I want to say about gun violence in our country, and how Christians in particular should think about guns and how we should think about violence. I want to talk about how we should think about partisan political argumentation, part of which I just did by reading you from Scandalous Witness. I also want to talk about ongoing battles of racism or critical race theory. If you live in Washington, North Carolina, where I live, you drive by through town and you don't have to drive too many miles before you start seeing a bunch of signs. They're huge white signs put in people's yards or in businesses with a huge red circle and the words CRT in the middle of the circle and one of those circles with a slash through it, like in the old no smoking signs or whatever. And so what people are doing is saying, well, we don't like critical race theory. Well, it's almost comical to me, but so few people, even scholars, can perfectly define what critical race theory even means. But we know it certainly can't mean anything that has to do with talking about racial matters that might be present in a world, but we as white people might not be able to see them. Okay, but I just want to remind us as a church that the Christians in this country have a very ugly history of ways that the Bible was used to justify horrific treatment of African American people. And right now, there's a lot of pushback going on about history is being rewritten and people are being taught the wrong things in schools and they're being told to demonize something that's great. I think we need to listen to what is being said and find out, am I, in my natural defensiveness, simply unaware of those realities? Or do those realities simply not exist because I'm not aware of them? We have to ask that question. That question, I'm afraid, happens over and over and over. A person believes that their view is the only right view, and anybody who has a different view is just wrong. Well, I'm telling you, that's baked in to the way many people are taught to think about God and about the Bible. People don't realize that their interpretation of the Bible is not the same as what the Bible says or what the Bible means. Getting people to believe that, though, is hard, and it may be a futile attempt, but I'm going to attempt it nonetheless. I want to talk about people who are deconstructing their faith in the church, people who are walking away, particularly young people. I want to talk about the fact that there is sexual abuse in churches and subsequent year-long cover-ups of such abuse. I want to talk about the Supreme Court. I want to talk about abortion. I want to talk about the current hearings about the January 6th incident from 2021 and several other areas. I don't know what form this will take. I think guns and abortion and racism are probably at the top of my list, but I have lots of friends who are in a deconstructing mindset right now, who are dismantling ideas that they've believed about God for a long time. I've gone through several of those myself. Some people that I know cannot handle the amount of deconstruction that's required to make sense of the world, and so they chuck the entire Christian faith. And I get it. I really, really get it. I'm not there personally. I think that there are many, many salvageable components to this, but I believe it takes a lot of time, a lot of patience, a lot of care, and a lot of deep thinking about the way we have misunderstood key components of who God is. And while I can't even attempt, and I'm not even going to pretend to be prepared to talk about every one of them, what I'm going to do is talk about the places at which our belief systems are driven more by a power over idea than they are by a power under one. And I'm not critiquing you from an ivory tower. I am down in the hole with you. And I don't like the fact that we're in a hole, but I'm willing to admit we're in a hole. And I'm going to talk to you while we're down there, being a person who's also in a hole, who has gone there willingly and who didn't know he was there, but now I do, and I'm seeing that it's time to do something about it, and I want us to get out together. I don't know how long it'll take. I don't know what it'll look like. I don't know how dirty we'll be. I don't know if we'll die trying, but we're going to try anyway. And that's really what I want to do over the next several weeks. So I know this episode was kind of long. I didn't intend for it to be this long, but thank you so much for tuning in, for listening, for engaging me with questions. I really appreciate you all. I have a new supporter on the podcast, and I'm really thankful for that. Thank you so much for those who are supporting Unbinding the Bible on a monthly basis. There's always a link at the bottom of these episodes for you to click that and to find out a way that through Anchor or now through Spotify, you can support Unbinding the Bible. 99 cents, $4.99, $9.99 a month. And it really does help. It's a psychological and a spiritual encouragement for me. And then it also helps me provide resources and recording equipment and other things that I'm always trying to think of ways of branching out and doing things that I haven't yet done. And so I really appreciate that. But that is all I have for this week. I hope you have a fantastic week, and I will talk to you next time.